Thank you very much for that first look at some really ravishing works. I'm happy to ask Nancy Locke to come join us for the next paper. Dr. Locke is a professor of art history and the director of graduate studies in art history at Pennsylvania State University and president of the Association of Historians of 19th Century Art. She is the author of Manet and the Family Romance, published in 2001, and Cezanne's Shadows, which I've finally gotten my hands on, published this year. Today, she will be speaking with us about the presence of Cezanne's work in New York collections in the first decades of the 20th century and their influence on notable American modernists in the orbit of Hans Hofmann. Professor Locke.
Thank you so much, Katie. Is this on? Yeah, thank you so much. And can you hear me in the back? Okay, here we go. And apologies that I'm going to be speaking in English. Okay. On August 28th, 1950, the German-born American artist Hans Hofmann, who was 70 years old and already recognized as an important abstract painter and influential teacher, gave a talk for the Art Association of Provincetown, Massachusetts. Abstract art, Hofmann said, goes back to Cezanne, who charged his pictures to the limit of his palette. His highly saturated and powerful work is marked by great simplicity. It is the accumulation of quality that makes it so simple. Cezanne's revolutionary principles of composition brought nature as experience again under pictorial control. The last words in that passage were underlined, brought nature as experience again under pictorial control. And in this talk, I would like to consider what Hofmann might have meant. How did an audience of artists and art amateurs in 1950 in the United States understand what Hofmann had to say? What was going on in Hofmann's work that he was still grappling with Cezanne, who had become the artist of the moment back when Hofmann first went to Paris in 1904? Most of all, what did Hofmann make of Cezanne, and how would Hofmann's trajectory from Bavaria to Paris and Paris to New York become an important strand of the transmission of Cezannian artistic principles in the first half of the 20th century in the United States? In terms of the presence of Cezanne in New York in the early 20th century, John Rewald and Jane Warman have made significant contributions to our understanding, and Mary Tompkins Lewis has written about Hans Hofmann's debt to Cezanne. In this paper, I would like to build on this foundation and to look more deeply into not only the theory of Cezanne's art or Cezannian modernism that informed Hofmann's work, but also the form that is created once the brush hits the canvas across the Atlantic. For this reason, I will be looking at specific Cezannes exhibited in New York and trying to explicate Hofmann paintings in terms of his responses to those works. Earlier this year, the exhibition Lily P. Bliss and the Birth of the Modern at the Museum of Modern Art in New York emphasized the centrality of Lily Bliss's collection of Cezannes to the foundation of that museum. Works like Still Life with Apples, which appeared on the exhibition publicity materials, or The Bather, which had long been an icon for MoMA's collection of modernist painting, served as touchstones for the exhibition. In the first half of the 20th century, however, several exhibitions of the Bliss collection included works that did not remain in the Museum of Modern Art. One such work was Cezanne's portrait, Victor Choquet Seated. Although it was part of Lily Bliss's bequest to MoMA, it was deaccessioned in 1941, turned over to Paul Rosenberg, and eventually sold to the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Ohio, where it has remained since 1950. Hans Hofmann had already seen Cezanne's work in Paris, where he lived from 1905 to 1913. He traveled to the United States in 1930, and after teaching in Berkeley that year and in 1931, then in Los Angeles in 1932, he moved to New York in September, likely missing the inaugural 1931 exhibition of the Lily P. Bliss collection at MoMA in the middle of the year. The Bliss collection would be shown again, however, in mid-1934, and Victor Choquet's Seated was included in a MoMA anniversary exhibition in late 34 and early 35. With Hofmann founding his own School of Fine Arts on East 57th Street in mid-1934, it is almost certain that he saw this painting in 1934 or 35. What would Hofmann have made of this small painting, just 45 centimeters high, especially given the extent to which his own painting was still steeped in School of Paris work, as well as that of Matisse in the mid-1930s? The geometries that Meyer Shapiro wrote about would surely have registered with Hofmann. The chromatic harmonies of the yellow gold frames and the gilt Louis XVI chair, the red of the upholstery and the red components of the carpet stand out, even before one registers the red teardrop shapes against the dark green wallpaper. Shapiro describes it as a constructed form. Quote, "The whole is a banding and fitting of mainly horizontal and vertical strips of rich color, like a section of mosaic or a patchwork rug. The principle is clear," Shapiro continues, "to unite on the picture surface what lies at different depths." Even if many Cezannes, including ones as early as 1877, interlock foreground and background, the portrait of Choquet Seated might well be a limit case of Cezanne bringing every pictorial element into contact on one very active plane. The more one studies the red teardrop shapes, the more it appears that Cezanne moved from representing shapes in wallpaper to finding more shapes in the mahogany piece of furniture, on the picture frame at right. So if you look just above the little landscape, you see a red spot on the frame. In areas of the red upholstery, where it's almost like marks of wear, but in fact there are red areas kind of standing out. And even seeing to it that Choquet's mouth took the place of a red teardrop from the wallpaper hidden from view. One painting in which I think we see Hofmann trying to put to work certain formal aspects of Victor Choquet Seated is Untitled Interior Composition, with its date of 1935, tying it to the 1934 and 35 exhibitions of Choquet Seated in New York. Like Cezanne's painting, it is an interior with strong rectilinear elements. At a height of 110 centimeters, it is not twice the height of the Cezanne, but is considerably larger. As Michael Shryock has written, the painting is part of a series of interiors with a yellow chest of drawers, a yellow amphora, other pots or jars, and an easel with a painting in progress of this very interior with a cupboard, drawers, and the yellow amphora atop. So I hope you can see that, the base of the easel and then the picture of the yellow furniture and the pots on top. Cezanne's painting does include works of art from Choquet's own collection in the background, but the painting within a painting in the Hofmann constitutes a difference. Looking at them strictly in formal terms, however, many more similarities emerge. If Cezanne makes the yellow frames and chair legs almost vibrate against the green walls and blue carpet, Hofmann takes out Cezanne's muting and nuancing of the walls, and he has his yellow chest and yellow amphora clash noisily with the blue background on the pictured canvas. One of the things that is wrong with Hofmann's painting may well be the extent to which all three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, compete for attention. One sees him leaning a little bit on orange at right and in patches on the canvas, but the red still dominates. Likewise, blue shifts to green, a secondary color, on the left side of the canvas. Cezanne does much, much more of this shifting to secondary colors. Most of the reds in the Choquet painting are almost orange or brown, and even the green has been muted considerably. Taking one primary out of the equation and substituting a secondary in its place creates vibrancy without the garishness we see in the Hofmann. Yet it is clear what Hofmann saw in Victor Choquet's Seated: strong horizontal and vertical elements of yellow and blue, and rounded red shapes simultaneously pinning the wall into place and leaping forward to interact with the green wallpaper or the blue carpet. Hofmann has done exactly this, outlining his amphora in red, creating drawer pulls, jars, and knobs that are spaced apart and red, especially the red circle in the middle of the array of objects on the chest in the canvas, and the red knob forms on the drawer fronts as they appear in the painting on the easel. We know from other paintings in the series that the round object next to the yellow amphora in Hofmann's setup was probably not red at all. He outlines it in red or pictures it as yellow in other paintings, but in Untitled, he makes the pot red to serve a pictorial function like the red teardrops in Victor Choquet's wallpaper. Looking at the Cezanne, Hofmann was probably less interested in Cezanne's rendering of light on Choquet's dark suit and more interested in the expanse of blue the light created and how it could interact with the yellow and red of the chair. Despite the huge differences in facture, subject matter, and intent between the two paintings, Hofmann turns Choquet's head into a yellow amphora in his painting. The amphora is like a trophy set off by red badges strategically placed across the canvas. Let us recall the quote I started with, Hofmann describing Cezanne's colors as highly saturated, his pictures, quote, charged to the limit of his palette. For us, looking at Cezanne's colors in general, we see subtle modulation in tone and hue, although the relations between colors in Choquet's Seated create a vibrant interaction associated with highly saturated colors. Hofmann emphasized the role of color in Cezanne and in painting in general. In his Notes on Art of 1950, he writes, "A color seen by itself seems to change into another color in a relation. Its color expressiveness changes within every other relation. Every color shade suggests volume. Volume is depth. Depth is a dimension." In this passage, Hofmann zeroes in on a fundamental property underpinning every Cezanne painting, that a color changes into another color in a relation. One of the easiest places to see this principle in action is a painting left in an early state or a watercolor. And this one, Study of Foliage, part of the Bliss collection and still at MoMA, was shown in that same 1934 MoMA exhibition as Victor Choquet's Seated. Red appears sparingly in this watercolor, but it is instructive to compare an area in which the red appears more on its own, such as the very open blossom. So this is on the right toward the bottom edge of the painting, this very open blossom where the red is helping the blossom to kind of come forward and be convex. And then areas above the center in which red juxtaposed with blue can become shadowy and recessive, even if the red remains distinct. I would like to turn back to Hofmann's 1950 Provincetown talk quoted at the beginning. Cezanne's revolutionary principles of composition brought nature as experience, again under pictorial control. What would the idea of nature as experience have meant to a painter who interacted with other foreign artists in Paris at the height of Cézannisme in 1907, but who did not, as far as we know, travel to Provence to see the source for rocks near the caves above the Chateau Noir. This watercolor, too, was included in the 1934 Bliss exhibition in New York. But when Hofmann likely saw it, he would not have been thinking necessarily of Cezanne's particular experience of nature around the Bebemus quarry or the Chateau Noir. He would have been thinking in more general terms about a human experience of nature. The MoMA watercolor remains a vivid example of anthropomorphized rocks that resemble nude figures in a Rubens allegory, to which Hofmann adds the idea of being brought under pictorial control. Despite the highly variegated nature of the motif, which it's fun to see it next to the watercolor, Cezanne uses few colors, creates a unit curve, regularizes the size of the patches of color, and emphasizes a grid-like structure. Indeed, the tension in the work between the irregular or organic and the architectonic or the grid becomes almost explosive. Hofmann tried something like it in House in Storm of 1939. Grid-like lines that hint at orthogonal elements such as walls and a roof are visible across the painting made on board, which is smaller than Choquet's seated at 51 by 61 centimeters. Even if there is a literal house to be found in House in Storm, which is far from a guarantee given Hofmann's poetic titles, the more irregular patches of arbitrary color overwhelm the architectural. As in rocks near the caves above the Chateau Noir, these are pendulous curving forms and larger patches of color over the remains of a grid. The Cezanne watercolor displays more emphatic drawing done late in the process than many watercolors, and Hofmann, for his part, adds drawing in red, blue, and purple in the upper right. Hofmann's title evokes the forces of nature, even if his palette veers away from the organic. For Hofmann, an understanding of the ways colors change and function in relation leads directly to his theory of push and pull. This famous theory, which was influential to generations of art students, emphasizes the ability to create three-dimensionality across a two-dimensional surface with color without making what he called holes in the canvas. Depth or three-dimensionality for Hofmann was not the same thing as illusionistic space, but rather a palpable spatial dynamism that was essential to his theory of push and pull. As Mary Tompkins Lewis has noted, Hofmann described the function of push and pull by again referring to Cezanne. So this is Hofmann. At the end of his life and at the height of his capacity, Cezanne understood color as a force of push and pull. In his pictures, he created an enormous sense of volume, breathing, pulsating, expanding, contracting through his use of color. We're looking at Pines and Rocks, another Lily Bliss canvas from MoMA's 1934 exhibition, a magisterial example of volumetric boulders, light pulsating in the pines, and the kind of expansion and contraction through color that Hofmann discussed in his 1948 essay. It is beyond dispute that Cezanne deeply informs Hofmann's great theory. As we see in this key passage, it is color that lies at the heart of push and pull. With respect to color, Hofmann distinguished between what he called tonal painting and his idea of pure painting, which was the antithesis of tonal painting. So-called tonal painting, quote, degraded color to a mere black and white function. Hofmann noted that tonal gradation can be produced by any kind of color mixture. The passage is striking as a reading of Cezanne precisely because we frequently speak of Cezanne's color modeling in trying to summarize his achievement, or at least I do when I teach surveys of art history. And it seems that Hofmann does not view Cezanne's color modeling as tonal, as working toward a representation of three-dimensionality. Hofmann, though, was probably right, regardless of what I tell my beginning students. In the Lily Bliss still life with apples, for instance, it is not the case that the color mixtures on the grapefruit at right, so I'll zoom in a little so you see that grapefruit more clearly, that those color mixtures serve only to create gradations of light and dark. The right edge of the fruit is almost scratched with a scumbled red-brown that is remarkably light for a shadowed edge. The play of light across the top and left of the grapefruit means that yellow bleeds into the white tablecloth. On an apple at left, and it's the one right directly under the wine glass there, the brightest red hugs the left side of the fruit that is supposed to recede. And various other patches of bright red and orange also heighten the left side of the fruit, irrespective of the point closest to the viewer. The patches become like states on a map, sitting side by side in their distinctive forms. Cezanne's color modeling is too patchy to be concerned with mere rendering of tonal values through color. Hofmann would have seen that Cezanne's deployment of color, ostensibly to model, transcends value and modeling in favor of abstract relations. Part of what Cezanne is registering in the still life with apples has to do with an experience of the whole. An individual piece of fruit is not seen in isolation. By contrast, it casts a shadow on another fruit, or the white tablecloth adds fill light to its underside, or it takes on a tinge of color from the object next to it. Hofmann would have seen a vivid example of push and pull in Cezanne in La Route, a work that was part of the 1934 Bliss exhibition. Like Choquet Seated, it was among the works Bliss bequeathed to MoMA, but was deaccessioned. In the case of La Route, it was in private hands before becoming part of the collection of the Kunstmuseum Basel in 1998. It is dated to circa 1871 and has some of the characteristics of late 1860s Cezanne's, with its undulating hillside and heavy road. Parts of the landscape and the clouds appear to have been reworked in a constructive stroke method that could well have taken place a little bit later in the mid-70s. In 1934, Alfred Barr referred to it as the cornerstone of Lily Bliss's group of Cezannes, as the painting was her very first Cezanne acquisition. Alongside the Bather and Pines and Rocks, however, what would have stood out to Hofmann was the overall yin and yang of the composition, divided almost in two between sky and land. As T.J. Clark has observed of Cezanne's painting after Pissarro's Louveciennes, a work contemporary with La Route, the landscape creates a measurable distance from a Pissarro-type concern with atmosphere. It is, quote, heavier, thicker, but in the end more solid, more fixed in place by light. In La Route, the sky is weighed down by its own substance. The sky may be blue, but the air has taken on a material character. It hangs down like a theatrical curtain before meeting the trees and hillside one on one. The road with its bend, which would go on to be a favored motif for Cezanne, looks more like batter poured across the land than puffing up before solidifying on contact. An essay in the 1934 MoMA catalog refers to, quote, the rude primitive projection of isolated masses of color in place of value. In other words, in 1934, it was already valued as an abstraction of masses rather than as an example of impressionism or the perception of landscape. That La Route made an impression on Hans Hofmann in 1934 can be seen in his landscape of 1936 with its undulating hillside at right and its dark blue sky covering more than half the canvas. Nevertheless, it is thinly painted, more like Dufy than like Cezanne, and it is part of a series of oil or casein on panel with landscapes of differing configurations. A more apt comparison comes in 1941, an oil on panel landscape in which brushstrokes of yellow and green earth have been laid on with a weight equal to the deep blue ones for sky. The abstraction is indisputably a landscape, and it is almost the same size as La Route, almost exactly the same size. It became an early example of Hofmann's push and pull working with larger areas of color rather than the small patches of pulsating color in pines and rocks, which is what makes La Route such an instructive model. In Cezanne's example, there may be constructive stroke color modulations on the hillside, clouds, and road, but the light congeals rather than weightlessly illuminating the landscape. Light alludes to an opacity rather than trying to replicate a translucency. The material solidity of light in Cezanne's La Route matters to Hofmann, who, after all, was not trying to paint in a perceptual manner. The kind of light we see in La Route becomes a component of Hofmann's theory of color in pure painting, what he calls pure painting. Here is Hofmann describing the role of color in painting. Quote, in pure painting, color serves simultaneously a plastic and psychological purpose. Color in itself is light. In nature, light creates the color. In the picture, color creates light. Hofmann goes on to describe the manufacture of color relationships by the artist. His statement, color creates light, reveals its situatedness in mid-20th century US painting culture. Painters in Hofmann's world do not look at landscapes and search for ways to make oil paint register the effects of light they perceive. They are more interested in what happens on the canvas than in nature. It is revealing of Cezanne's achievement that he could care deeply about looking at the landscape and trying to register his sensations, but also conceive of his painting in such a way that 70 years later, an abstract painter would base a theory of push and pull on it, a theory that became foundational to an entire school of painting. Clement Greenberg attended 3 lectures that Hans Hofmann gave at his school in 1938-39 and credits Hofmann with influencing his own theories of modern art. When Greenberg included Cezanne alongside Picasso, Matisse, and other foundational figures of modern abstraction that, quote, derive their chief inspiration from the medium they work in, he noted that he, quote, owed that formulation to a remark made by Hans Hofmann. Thus, we find that the Cezanne in the New York of the 1930s and 40s was a modernist Cezanne, an abstract Cezanne. By looking back at the Cezannes that were on view at MoMA, we can better understand not only the work and teachings of Hans Hofmann, but also the idea of flatness that dominated the thinking of Clement Greenberg. In his essay, Abstract Art of 1944, Greenberg describes a principal feature of modernist painting in the work of Cezanne, writing, to acknowledge the brute flatness of the surface on which he was trying to create a new and less deceptive illusion of the third dimension, Cezanne broke up the objects he depicted into multiplicities of planes that were as closely parallel as possible to the canvas's surface. And to show recession, the planes were stepped back with comparative abruptness. Even the receding edges of objects keep turning full face to the spectator like courtiers leaving the presence of royalty. In a few words, Greenberg describes flatness in Cezanne not in terms of design, but in terms of tension, obligation, formality. Whether it was rocks or apples, the objects in Cezanne turn purposely to the viewer to activate the picture plane and hold it in tension with planes in front of or behind it. The brushstrokes on the hillside of La Route turn toward the viewer like playing cards instead of plunging into recessive depths and crevices. The Cezanne in New York in the 1930s and 40s provided the basis for a new kind of abstract painting, one whose reverberations would be felt in the work of artists like Joan Mitchell, and in the work of every painter who invoked Hofmann's push and pull in approaching a canvas. Thank you.